thank you all for coming. Let me explain a little bit about what this is about, what the idea behind this lecture series is. Many of you might remember that last summer I did a series of lectures on Russian internet memes, and that was in support of a book I was writing that is coming out in February on Russian internet memes. So it was really doing double or triple duty there. It was about making myself do the work, but also, you know, just having a sense of scholarly community while we were also isolated. So that has a very specific context. This is much more of just kind of a lark, really. This is not any serious ongoing research I'm doing. There is no book that's going to come out of it, no plan for publishing. I think to do this topic justice, it might require archival research, which I have hoped never to do in my life, and I've gone pretty far without it so far. So, so there you go. And also, I would say that this is not going to be, there's not going to be a great deal of deep original thought here. So please dial your expectations down to low. I'm really just kind of curating these commercials, which are lots of fun, and talking about them. Now, also in terms of how this is going to go, with the Russian internet memes lecture, I had a keynote, a PowerPoint that I shared with you. I'm doing it a little bit differently now. So on my website, I have a page for the Russian commercial series, and Sasha's going to put the link in the chat. And on that page, there's a link to this particular lecture. And on that page is all the images and all the videos that I'm going to show. And one of the reasons I'm doing that is just in case watching the videos over Zoom is not working for you, you can mute the Zoom and watch it on YouTube through your own internet connection rather than over Zoom. That also means I'm not going to talk over the commercial. I'll talk about the commercial afterwards. And that also means that the videos are available for you to look at afterwards if you should so choose. And I have transcribed and translated the text of all the commercials, which was not such a big task because, as you'll see, there's very little use of words in a lot of these. But where I am way too lazy to do anything is to actually do the subtitling. It's such a miserable, awful process, and I just don't love you all that much. So instead, I have the English text of the commercials under each video on my website, but also towards the very top, there are links where you can download either a docx file or a PDF file with the Russian and English text of the commercial. So if you choose, you can be looking at the commercials in one window and reading the text in another. So that's the whole setup here. It's actually much more complicated to describe than I hope to use. Okay, so I started thinking about this idea about Russian commercials when I was working on memes, because as I was working on internet memes, I was thinking about the media and memetic ecosystem that internet memes entered into. And both in Russia and the West, a lot of that space contained commercials. In the West, of course, the tradition of TV commercials goes way, way back and oversaturated our consciousness before people stopped watching network TV so much. But as we know, in the Soviet Union, TV commercials were not a huge phenomenon. And this is something that's always been in the back of my mind, I think, because of the first time I went to the Soviet Union in 1986. I went to Leningrad, and I had this interesting kind of cognitive dissonance that on the one hand, I was really annoyed by all the propaganda posters. On the other hand, they were really easy to tune out because they were so monotonous. And what I discovered fairly early on was my 4 months in Leningrad were like a wonderful break, like a cleanse from the American television commercials that saturated my life, less in college than before that, and also just the advertising everywhere. It was largely an advertising-free world, and to live in an urban environment that had almost no advertising besides political propaganda was really kind of astonishing. And going back to the United States, it was like being dropped on the set of Blade Runner. The contrast was really huge. But propaganda and advertising occupy a lot of the same media space, and they're both about selling and pushing. And let's remember that propaganda, the term propaganda, I mean, one of the things that's so odd when we hear news translated back from Russian and they're talking about propaganda is that in Russian, they still use the word propaganda more like we used to use the word propaganda, that it's not just a negative thing. It's simply what is now called public relations, PR. Public relations was basically invented so as not to call it propaganda. But so advertising and propaganda are basically doing the same things, except that they're focused on different types of, on selling or pushing different types of things. So capitalist countries obviously directly advertise products and indirectly advertise ideology, right? So, you know, you have the commercial for the beautiful car and where they're selling you the car, but they're also selling you a lifestyle and they're selling you the American dream. I mean, all of this is pretty obvious. But the pretext and the main reason the ad people are working on it is the product itself. In the USSR, I would say it worked largely the other way. That what was being advertised and pushed was ideology and occasionally products as a way to get you towards the ideology. Because the priorities were obviously different. Even if you think in terms of products being sold in the Soviet Union or being, let's say, propagandized in the Soviet Union, the whole relationship with products was really more about production, obviously, than consumption. You're advertising the greatness of producing things rather than the greatness of buying things. What we can build, what we can do, not what you can buy and what you can get. Now, there are moments of exceptions, obviously. Most famously during the New Economic Policy, the NEP, in the 1920s, when you had Mayakovsky and Rodchenko doing the Oknorosta. And now I'm going to share the screen, which is going to take me a second, as always. Okay, here we go. Okay, so you should see my website here. So then you click, there's a whole bunch of, there's, you know, hours of family fun here. Press on Russian TV commercials, first lecture, keeping up with the Dzhonses, and scroll. Here's where we get the PDF and doc file. And here's just one example, one of the most famous examples of NEP era advertising for pacifiers. This is Mayakovsky and Rodchenko in 1923. It's a nice little rhyme in Russian. It's not a nice little rhyme in English, but basically there have never been any better pacifiers than the ones that you can buy everywhere from Rizina Trest. The slogan is, I'm ready to suck them to my old age. And I'm ready to suck to my old age might be the unofficial slogan of Soviet advertising and the entire Soviet consumer culture, though they didn't really necessarily know it. So there was a little bit of advertising in the 20s and still occasionally things that were sort of celebrating products in the Soviet Union after that. But the Soviet economy wasn't about scarce consumers, that is in the West, like trying to get consumers to be consumers again and buy something. It was about scarce goods. So why advertise if the problem is not what do I choose, but how do I get it? And by the way, I'm not dealing with print advertising otherwise. So one of the things we're going to be asking is then, you know, what is the purpose and what is being sold here? And to do that, though, so I have 9 commercials. The first commercial I want to show does not answer that question. And that first commercial actually functions completely differently, but I want to start with it before we then look at stuff that's actually going to help us figure out what's going on with Russian advertising. The first commercial is The Singing Corn from 1964, an operetta, which is quite famous. You can find it on YouTube. Obviously, everything I'm doing today is on YouTube. And again, the text is available. So if you don't want to watch on Zoom, get ready to click on your own site. I'm going to make the YouTube full screen. I think that should work well for you guys. If it doesn't, someone let me know, okay? Sasha, yell at me or something if it doesn't work that way, okay? So let's give it a shot. Are you seeing it?
We can't see your screen anymore.
You can't see the screen at all. That's what I thought. Okay, hold on. Okay, that is very weird. All right, I'm going to stop that. Let's start again. And I'm not going to make it bigger. And I'm going to reshare the screen. All right, that's an interesting experiment. Thank you for your patience. All right.
I think what might work best is if you open it in YouTube and you go to like the the larger viewing version in YouTube. Right.
I'm not prepared to do that, so I'm not going to do it, but that does make more sense. And next time I'll be prepared to do it.
No problem.
Okay. All right. So back. All right. So we're just going to.
Если хочешь быть здоровым, жить до 100 лет, обращайся с добрым добрым словом к ресторанам и столовым, получая обед. Подождите, посидите, не спешите, подождите, получай обед. Вы откуда?
Мы с Кубани. Мы росли в Азербайджане, в южной теплой стране.
На казахской целине. Ясно, что же вы хотите?
Мы хотим попасть в меню.
Нет уж, братцы, извините, нет уж, братцы, извините, я вас вовсе не гоню, но меню не изменю.
И салаты, и супы из маисовой крупы, а из сахарного сорта каши, пудинги и торты, и закуска, и гарнир. Словом, пир на весь мир.
Что за блюдо? Просто чудо. Каждый день готовить буду. И скажу вам без утайки, эти блюда без труда у любой домохозяйки получаются всегда, хоть куда.
Okay. I hope that I'm at some point I would like to know if you guys were able to watch it on the Zoom, but we're not really talking right now, so I'll find that out later. All right, so this commercial is different from some of the others for a number of reasons. One is that this is a rare moment when they really are trying to drum up demand for something of which there is a surplus supply. And we're talking, of course, about Khrushchev's famous campaign to grow corn everywhere and to make everybody eat corn. And it's so associated with him that so many of the jokes about Khrushchev, some of the images of Khrushchev have him with ears of corn, and I think it developed perhaps a negative Pavlovian reflex for an entire generation when it came from corn. But whatever. The point is, there's corn, and they want people to eat it. So they actually want people to want something. Again, that is something very different from what we're going to be looking at largely. Also, I want to point out how, in many ways, the production values here are really good. From what I've read, a lot of these commercials are made by these professional filmmakers because, of course, they're not professional advertising clip makers. And they have a different aesthetic from what you would have if you were spending your entire time making commercials. The animation, I think, is rather adorable. But what we see, and what we're going to see in a lot of these clips, is really weird editing, like really weird drastic cuts from one moment to another that I don't think is trying to be in the tradition of Eisenstein. But this just is I think rather jarring. I find it rather jarring, and that is after years of us in the West consuming all of these fast-paced films and music videos where there is a lot of jump cutting and moving back and forth. But this seems kind of unmotivated, and it's almost at times like you can see the seams. I also want to point out that there's horrific table manners on view here with the woman with the fruit in her teeth. And that what we're seeing here, what we're hearing here is something we're going to hear in a lot of the commercials, which is a particular intonation. Now, those of you who studied Russian as a second language at the right time might have learned various ika, intonation constructions, like how to ask a question, how to answer a question. I don't think we ever learned what the ika was for kind of pompous восторженность, when you're sort of declaiming and presenting something. There's a lot of that in these commercials, which to my ear, and my ear might not be right here, but my ear of not being from that time and that place ends up seeming kind of hokey. And what I want us to look at over the course of these weeks is what happens to that intonation, because what we're going to see, spoiler alert, is by the 90s, this weird hybrid of this kind of old-fashioned exhortative intonation and something else, which I had never heard before commercials in Russia, and is a way of speaking that I only hear on TV. So again, that's a little preview of what we have coming up. Another thing about this commercial is they're advertising a product, but they're not actually advertising a brand. Then even in the Soviet Union, there were brands, right? I mean, half of them were Lotus or something, but there's still brands. And here, there's no brand. It's just corn. Just please buy corn in whatever form. For God's sakes, buy corn. The appeal is direct. You should eat this stuff. It's playful and fun. And as a little factoid, in the research that I have done in assembling this lecture, almost all the time when I see people writing about Soviet commercials, they talk about this commercial and then they skip right to the 80s, which I'm not sure what that says, except that for a lot of the people reading and interested, the real action is in the 80s, which makes sense. But for today, I'm more concerned with the stuff that gets us to where we have commercials that are trying to look a bit more like people thought commercials looked like in the West. So as we move on to this commercials, there are a few things I want to say as a preface. One, these are not meant to be representative because I just got them on YouTube. This is how lazy I am for this lecture. That's it. It's just YouTube. Now, there are a lot more commercials I found on YouTube. These are the ones that I thought were really interesting, but I don't know out of how many commercials this selection really is. And I couldn't even find dates for all of them, which is really shameful if you're thinking about publishing. I looked and looked, and only for a few of them did I find exact dates. When there's an exact date, I put it on the website. The style, as I've already indicated, the weird jump cut editing. There's also a lot of voiceover work here where you have people who could be actors who could be talking to each other, but instead their voices off camera or narrators, giving it a sort of feel of like some terrible movie you're watching on Mystery Science Theater 3000. I assume that had something to do with production. I'm not really sure. In terms of content, we start to see a pattern. I think one of the things that's going on that's kind of obvious if you've read like a lot of stuff about, post-Stalinist culture is that there is an emphasis on a kind of kulturnost here, a culturedness, right? Of showing people how to have a good and proper cultured domestic life. In almost all of these commercials, which I find really interesting given the almost total lack of a large scale consumer culture, is the appeal to your individual taste. You will be able to find things to meet your taste, which again sounds like overselling given the lack of variety, but on the other hand, maybe not, because there's a question here of perhaps conditioning your tastes. And then I think the most important part of this is about fantasy, right? Because advertisements are fantasies. The beautiful car I talked about that most of us are never going to have, the big house, the vacation, all of it. It's all fantasy. And one of the things that advertising does is help shape your fantasy, presumably based on what the makers of the advertising think you might already want. But they help give it form and they give it contours. And what I think some of these commercials are doing in a time of scarcity, in a time when there's no real need to advertise a product, is that in a way they are sketching the contours of what would be acceptable and maybe sort of possible fantasy, sketching out a kind of consumer desire for things that you might not be able to get, but that are close to being possible to get. You can't wish for a Rolls Royce, but look what you can wish for. And in that way, and I have no proof of this, this is totally idle speculation. If you think in terms of competition with the lure of the West and all of that, you could see this as a kind of counteractive measure where if you get to see stuff from the West, you have this fancy of all these things that you could only get if you could get them on the black market. But here is a set of things that you might not be able to get, but imagining having them is more reasonable because they are out there somewhere in your world, right? So it's sketching out boundaries of things you're still not going to have, but could almost theoretically have. Remember the old Soviet joke about going to the meat store and asking for fish and being told, no, across the street is the fish store. That's where they don't have fish, right? The whole idea being, where to find your scarcity. And this is identifying what kind of scarcity you could conceivably be trying to, could be a void that you're trying to fill. I might not be able to get this, but someone can, and maybe someday with the right connections, it would be possible. Also, remember that presumably these advertisements are being made probably in Moscow and Leningrad and other Republic capitals, especially as we're going to see next week when we're looking at stuff made from Estonia. But these are being aired presumably across the country. So another thing they're doing is, well, imagine how differently this looks if you're watching this in Moscow or Leningrad than if you're watching it, if you happen to have access to a TV out somewhere in the countryside, in some small town somewhere. It's also creating an image for you of, what life in the capital could be like, what the good life could possibly be. And even if they're not being given the good life, there is, I think, a power in being able to identify the good life. Certainly that's a very important American strategy. So that's the kind of contours that I wanted to lay out for the commercials that we're going to look at now. So going on, and this one I will try just to click on the YouTube thing and see if it works. If it doesn't, we will stop. This is an advertisement for furniture with the actor Mikhail Boyarsky. That is not him, obviously, from 1974. And let's see what happens when I click watch on YouTube. Oh, I can watch on YouTube. Imagine that. Now, are you still seeing it? Good.
Вы мечтаете красиво и современно обставить квартиру? В магазинах, торгующих мебелью по образцам, вы наверняка найдете то, что соответствует вашему вкусу.
Okay. Let's see. All right, you still seeing my screen? Oh, no. Okay. So it's almost like we've gone back in time and watched the evolution of IKEA from a distant socialist ancestor. There's a lot going on here. And in terms of both how it's being filmed and what's being shown here, I think this one really illustrates the idea that I'm trying to put across of sketching out fantasy for you, because they are in an empty room and we're imagining things, and here are the things that they could imagine, which is why we're spending so much time just looking at them staring, right? The woman in particular has some really weird smiles at times. There's really a strange music change when they fantasize. The stop motion furnishing is, I suppose, a good touch. But what I like about that is as they get more and more furniture and they get their apartment filled, right before it disappears to show that this is just fantasy, they actually look like they're just being completely surrounded by hostile furniture that's keeping them in prison. So I don't think that was intentional, but it's a nice little effect. And again, the idea that you're going to find something that matches your taste. There's that weird moment at the end when, after showing all the different things in the furniture warehouse, they show that sort of traditional rooster print on the cutting board, which I find rather jarring. Maybe it's an attempt to show that this is still kind of familiar and domestic, but I would hope you didn't need to go to a model furniture store to be able to find that. But ultimately this works too, because it's about furnishing, but this is really demonstrating that they're not just talking about furnishing their apartment, they're sort of supplying the furniture in your head, what's going to populate your fantasy. All right, and that's what TV does. So let's look at the Unist 402. I think I had something like this at one point, but I think it might have been a Lithuanian non-exploding one. Okay, so we're going to watch this one on YouTube, and this is from 1977. Starring a well-known actor right before he died. Vasily Merkuriev.
Папа, что ты ищешь?
Где телевизор? Куда подевался мой телевизор?
Странный вопрос, не правда ли? Но не спешите удивляться.
А ты не видела моего телевизора? Хорошо сейчас атаковал Горстков. Трудный год выдался для Евгения Горсткова, 77-й. И все-таки год для него прошел отлично. Он стал 4-й раз чемпионом Советского Союза в тяжелом весе. Выиграл звание чемпиона Европы в тяжелом весе. Получил звание заслуженного мастера спорта.
Портативный телевизор «Юность 402» с успехом может стать вторым телевизором в доме.
Okay. All right. So that one I just find absolutely adorable, really, in part because of the acting of the grandpa. I love when he sort of imitates the expression on his granddaughter's face when she says no. Again, really odd choices and weird cuts, you know, going from the woman, the daughter, staring at TV like she's Whistler's mother, and then jumping back and forth to his face, and then this other weird cut. But there's a lot of great stuff here in that what you find when he finds his TV is that the grandson is watching it and watching boxing. So part of the appeal here, I think, in this intergenerational household is this cobbling together of an all-male space where the guys can hang out and do what they want. Interestingly, it's the bathroom, right? But they get away from the women, from the woman and the girl, and because it's portable, right? They're able to go somewhere, even if they're still stuck in their own domestic space, and have a moment together and really enjoy something that presumably the women are not going to want to watch. Then we see someone, you know, plugging it into their car, which is, to my mind, an amazing moment of tone deafness, I think, for the audience. Like, this is presuming you have a car already, or you're going to then watch the TV in your car. It's really rather odd. But also, what could be tone deaf or aspirational is this idea that the unist can become the second television in your house. That, you know, that's not something to take for granted. That is a huge step forward, because most households would have been lucky just, well, they would have had one TV and that would be really it. So this is really selling a luxury item to the point that it's in your luxury car, but also that turns your personal space into something that is actually much more multifunctional and gives you something closer to, if not privacy, to separate space than you could have if you didn't have your wonderful portable television. Okay. Moving on to wedding stores. Okay, watch this one on YouTube. This is great. Okay.
Чем они так озабочены? Ведь у них скоро свадьба.
Хлопот много. Нет свадебных нарядов. Надо купить фату, платье для невесты, костюм, туфли, новый галстук.
Да, проблема.
Предоставьте решать ваши проблемы службе сервиса универмага «Юбилей».
Свадебный наряд по своему вкусу вы без труда сумеете приобрести в салоне для новобрачных универмага «Юбилей».
That's right. You can find it to match your taste, and this is what your taste is going to be, by the way. So this one is great. One, I have to say that I can't help but think that if say Americans were watching it at the time, this would be one moment where there could be a little bit of envy in that the coats they're wearing and the hats they're wearing in the beginning look awfully luxurious compared to what you would get in the United States. But this is, of course, there are plenty of reasons for that. But here you're telling a story, and very often they're trying to tell a story, and the movement from one scene to another, I think, is often one of the weak points in the direction telling a story. So there they are, happily walking in the woods, frolicking along the river. Everything's great, and then they're sitting in the room, and they're so miserable, and it's all work, and you have to have the voiceover people explaining how hard it is to arrange stuff for their wedding, and you have that very strange close-up of the bride on the bride's face, where either she's thinking about the wedding or she's plotting world domination. It's still unclear. And then suddenly they're walking downstairs in slow motion with weird lighting. Then we get her face again. Then they're walking together in the out from the beginning, going to the store, and everything's so fancy. They're trying on the rings, and again, it's all for your taste. The story here, I think, is pretty clear. This is the one that I don't know how many of you have ever seen the literal video version of the video Total Eclipse of the Heart, where they come up with words just saying what's happening there instead of the words in the song. I could see a great literal video for this particular thing. But anyway, wedding fantasy is pretty straightforward. All right, next we go on to lipstick.
Губная помада сделает вас еще привлекательнее, если среди множества оттенков вы найдете тот, который вам к лицу.
Right. By the way, the next to last moment, we're seeing all the revolving lipsticks, and the one's lying on top of the other, like this, and turning around. It looks to me like an RPG, like a rocket launcher or something instead of lipstick. But anyway, this one is thoroughly playful, right? Nice transitions between black and white and color, and the whole notion of beauty, and also the notion of how we set up an image and how we set up beauty. There's something a bit meta about here. And this is, I think, a moment where it's worth mentioning that I would speculate that given how few commercials there were, and given how differently they circulated, they would have probably been experienced quite differently, in that instead of commercials being persistent, annoying interruptions in what you're watching, these are colorful, interesting, often playful diversions from what you might be watching that might not even be all that exciting, right? These are almost short experimental films. So the power of them could just be to have something kind of fun and interesting to watch. And of course, think about your lipstick. All right, so we've gone from wedding to women's beauty, and now we have men's suits. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, sorry. I want to go to YouTube, right? Of course.
Что связывает этих мужчин? Чистая шерсть, из которой сделаны их костюмы. Костюмы из ткани. Столичная, родонит, союзная, тверская, Висла. Нарядные и деловые, на самый взыскательный вкус мужские костюмы из шерстяных тканей московского производственного объединения «Октябрь».
So that one is a classic. That wonderful weird motif of them holding the yarn, and it's literally it is what is binding these men together. There's one could imagine this kind of playful S&M thing. I don't think that's how it's intended at all. But there is this interesting attempt to try to grapple with men's grooming and men's appearance in an advertisement. So, and the way they do it then, there are a couple things they're doing. One is instead of having, like with the lipstick, this one woman, instead of having one man, this is something that I find sort of counterintuitive. I think when you have one man being displayed for his physical attractiveness, that is actually more subverting of codes of masculinity than having a bunch of men together being just the guys trying on suits. It makes the process of like considering what you're wearing seem a little bit more ordinary. It's hard with so much time passing for me to try to imagine how good those suits were supposed to look, because they don't really look so good now. And in terms of the choices being made to put this together, so first is the choice of having all the guys, then having each one of them stand up and pose, and then focus in on the wool, the yarn, I guess, from which it's made, which I'm not even sure what that's supposed to do, right? Like, wow, look at that wool. It's emphasizing these are different types of wool, but it's I don't think it's doing very much for selling the idea, except okay, these are different types of wool. All right, hold on a second. Whoa, excuse me a second. I lost. Okay, there we go. All right, so next we have the Topaz Accordion, which is just fun for everybody. Let's see this.
Электробаян «Топаз» вмещает в себя голоса многих электромузыкальных инструментов. Электробаян «Топаз» – это современная электронная музыка в руках баяниста.
Okay, I think at roughly the same time in America, there was a very frequently shown commercial for an item called Mr. Microphone, a portable microphone where if you talked into it, everybody could hear you. Hey, I'm on the radio. Hey, good looking. We'll be back to pick you up later. It was so cheesy. Everybody made fun of it. And there's something about this that strikes me as a really sad attempt at doing something similar. I recall how one of the things that's really struck me most when I read Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done is how really bad Chernyshevsky was at showing people having a good time. All they did was drink tea with clotted cream, tickle each other, and frolic. That was like the limits of his imagination of what fun is. And this is a commercial trying to show you having lots of fun. And they're really bad, I think, at showing and imagining fun in a way that's consistent with how people are supposed to behave at, say, concerts and so on and so forth. And even when when they're gathered around as the unsmiling accordion player is now playing for a group, they're standing there, someone's kind of smiling, their enthusiasm is rather restrained. Then we get on the boat and look, the girls like him, kids like him. But again, the enthusiasm is quite limited to the point where they have to just throw him onto a roller coaster to give some sense of how much fun it is. But on the whole, it's kind of zombie pod people fun. Okay, second to last one, but I think the most evocative one. And this is for an antique store. Sorry.
Вы скажете, так не бывает. Действительно, сегодня таких чердаков не найти. Потому что мы знаем, как разумнее всего избавиться от старинных вещей, которые нам не нужны.
So that one is amazing. First off, it starts out like it should be a haunted house movie or something, but instead it's not. The guy's rifling his stuff. Finally, he finds that piece of cloth he wants as he's smoking, as he's going through this whole room. But what's really fascinating here is that you could imagine an advertisement or a campaign that is about, wow, look at all this great stuff you could find in an antique store, right? I mean, this is the stuff of Antique Roadshow. This is the stuff of so much of our entertainment now. Look at all this fascinating stuff. And instead it's, finally, I'm rid of it. It's about, instead of being about encouraging consumption, it's about discouraging hoarding and the idea that all these things you have should just be fungible and ironically turned into money, right? You can just get rid of them. It's showing all this beautiful stuff, but really the message is sort of like the, sell your gold right now because you can make money on it. And it's particularly interesting if you think of, so much of the high intellectual culture that would come out in the 80s and 90s. I think of short stories by Tatiana Tolstaya, where there's all this fascination with this wonderful, cute little things you have in your apartment. And this world of these little things is so precious, right? And here it's just, can we please get rid of it all? It is a commercial for the opposite of consumption. And finally, a commercial for something that I think would be of use to almost no one watching television, but has some really great moments to it, and that is a trailer. So let's watch it. Oh, sorry.
дороге мы чувствуем себя как дома, потому что дом путешествует вместе с нами. Автоприцеп «Скиф» — это наш дом в дороге.
Okay. All right. So, oh, whoops. Hold on a second. All right. Go away. So this commercial, for one thing, this is what happens when you don't have to observe copyright. And it's also what happens when you don't understand the lyrics to the song that you're using. Eleanor Rigby is probably one of the saddest songs in the world. All the lonely people. Eleanor Rigby died in a church and is buried along with her name. To use this to sell any kind of happiness is truly absolutely amazing. It's kind of like, you know, advertising a relaxing spa weekend with smells like Teen Spirit or something. It's really just perfectly inappropriate, but also consistent. In the 90s, I remember watching the nightly news, and at the end, for the weather report, they would broadcast the weather report for the next day while playing the music from the Beatles' Yesterday. And I would point out, friends, you know, that this is about yesterday, and this is forecast for tomorrow, but you know, no one would notice, right? So again, this is advertising a product that is so far from being valuable for people. I mean, sure, you throw in the Unis television while you're driving. I imagine like the later Soviet joke about doing business in the Russian style. You know, I'll go get a truckload full of this. I'll get a truckload full of money. Maybe you could get your trailer, but you wouldn't have the car. It's a nice little advertisement for a kind of domesticity on the road, right? Of a nice little nuclear family. There's no babushka or diedushka here. The name Scythian is of course perfect. It's the nomads who presumably inhabited the land before the Slavs got there. It's a nice little setup for relaxation, but using Eleanor Rigby for it just absolutely kills me. Okay, so what's missing from the selection? Ads for services, like very famously, there were the slogan, fly Aeroflot, as if people had a choice. Like, no, I think I'm going to fly Delta, right? All you could do was fly Aeroflot. Or people make the same argument about, you know, store your money in Zbirkasa, though there I think there's actually an alternative they're trying to fight, which is store your money under the mattress, right? So there's a reason to do that one. But again, as I mentioned, this is all of these commercials are existing without a larger commercial ecosystem, so that if you're watching them, you would presumably pay more attention than you would if you're watching them as one of a hundred different commercials. So I think they're kind of interesting little curios. I think even at the time, most likely were like that. So in the next lecture, we're staying in the Soviet period. That's what the last one of the Soviet period. And we're looking primarily at the work of a man named Harry Egypt from Estonia, who's very big on YouTube, has a website, has a DVD of what he calls retro Soviet ads, of all of these ads his studio made largely in the 1980s. For various Soviet goods and services, and they're quite funny. He makes lots of interesting claims about how Soviet advertising works that are fascinating, and I have found absolutely no evidence of them. I've sent him a friend request on Facebook, but I haven't heard back from him. So I don't know if I'll have a great deal more information about him and his work by the time we get there. After that, we're going to finally get post-Soviet. We're going to go to Snickers, MMM, Bank Imperial, and then feminine hygiene, particularly Tampax. That's the next few lectures, and then we'll see where we go from there. That's all I have to say for today. So I'm happy to entertain questions or comments.
Great. So I'm going to open up the chat now. And I do have one question from Jane Harrison. Which years are all of the ads from that you played today?
Right, as I said, I couldn't find this information for most of these ads. I looked and looked, couldn't find it. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I knew. If anyone can find that out, I'd love to add that to this website.
And as a reminder, you can also use the raise your hand feature or send me a message asking to speak.
And if any of you actually remember seeing these commercials, that would be fascinating.
Question from Liz Elliott.
Okay.
I loved it, Elliot. Thanks so much. It was so much fun. I was thinking about your comment about intonation at the beginning. You know, that kind of parallels to me too, like some things when I listen to like radio shows that my dad used to listen to growing up, like that intonation kind of, I always kind of categorized it as like a broadcaster kind of intonation, but of course that's different here because they're in commercials, but they're different than what we're used to in the West, right? Well, everything that you were saying today. And so, and you see that changing over time too, right? So I also just thought about like the intonation contours. I don't think we would have ever learned those, right? Because we wouldn't, you know, if they would have even been categorized that way. And of course, the language has many more intonation contours than I remember learning, I think 8 or 9. But, you know, those were ones I always kind of understood as like specific for, you know, students of Russian as a foreign language. But I don't have anything more to say about that, but I was just kind of thinking about the parallels from just my own armchair observation.
No, that's really good. I mean, this intonation that I'm talking about isn't just on the commercials, but it is one that, yeah, the students wouldn't have to know, because how often is a student of a foreign language going to have to stand up on a stage and exhort people, you know, "Товарищи, мы так рады," you know, that sort of thing, right? That's not in the wheelhouse of your average language learner. But it's something that, in my mind anyway, is transitioning from a certain type of formality that is adopted at times as a kind of default in some of these commercials, and then starts to fade away in the 90s to get replaced by something else.
We have a question from Erica Eisen. Do you have any information about how long an ad would run?
So you mean how long it would be in circulation? The answer to that is no, I don't. In terms of how long ads were, what's interesting, by the way, that you can't see from this is, at least according to the reading I've done, there are plenty of ads that went on way longer than what we're used to, because why not, right? As one researcher put it, you know, there was no sense of like what airtime cost, right? That was not a scarce resource. So if you wanted to have a 3-minute commercial, you could have a 3-minute commercial, and people would probably watch it. There wasn't that much else to watch anyway.
And we have a follow-up question from Jane Harrison, who had asked about when the ads are from. The reason I ask is when I was there as a school kid and student in the 70s and then 80s and working in the late 80s, you could find nothing in the shops. So I was curious as to why they had ads when there was nothing in the shops.
Yeah, well, that's what I was speculating on, that it has, and we'll talk about it more with the 80s commercials, because it comes a little bit clearer. It is so divorced from actually trying to drive consumption that by the 80s, it actually looks like a kind of performance art or conceptual art that's going on here, rather than trying to drive things. But I can't help but think of it as a kind of simulation of a functioning economy in the absence of a functioning economy. But it does seem like a strange thing to spend time and effort on. Though, again, in terms of everything else going on in the Soviet Union, the amount of time and effort spent on this is minuscule. Harry Egypt will claim that this was actually mandated, that a certain amount of money and time be spent on these commercials. And that's the information that I have not been able to find anywhere. But yes, the contrast between this and what you would find in the stores was shocking. But this also, by the way, fits in with what I see as the contrast between Soviet television propaganda and contemporary Russian television propaganda. I've said this again and again, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself for a lot of you. That one of the reasons that I think contemporary Putinist propaganda works well is that it almost seems like it's been focus grouped. It's calculated to appeal to what people might already believe or are interested in, and also is not trying to convince you that what you see when you step outside on the street or step into the stores in your daily life is not happening. It's usually about things that you can't see directly. Soviet propaganda was really often about, you know, trying to convince you that the things that you're seeing are not really happening, like these images of well-stocked stores when you know the stores are not really well-stocked.
And we have a question from Timothy Sergey. Did anyone hear quotation of Ironia Судьбы in the wedding commercial?
I didn't. That doesn't mean it's not there. It's been so many years since I watched it, since I don't watch it every New Year's. But it seems not at all unlikely, assuming that it came out after Ironia Судьбы. Oh, it did, yeah. So maybe.
And Sasha Levitska, you had a question, but you had put your hand down. Do you still want to ask? Okay.
Thank you, Eliot. Thank you. Yes, my question is about, sorry, excuse me for a second. Yeah, sorry about that. So the question is about the famous prominent Soviet actors being featured so prominently in some of the commercials you just showed. And I was just thinking about the parallels between that and Western commercials, where it's usually wannabe actors who get their start in commercials, and then, well, sometimes if they get lucky, they become famous actors, and then they could do endorsements.
Yes.
While here is famous, Soviet actors like Mikhail Boyarsky, right? And I forgot the other guy's name who was in the antique store. What's his name? I can't remember him, but and they're just there, just not. Could you talk about it a little more? Do you think those were still some form of endorsements, or well, maybe slightly clandestine ones, or just something else? Thank you.
Sure. I would speculate that it just didn't mean, so there's so much meaning attached to being an actor playing in a commercial in the West, right? Especially, I say roughly at this time in the West, as you said, like starting out and then being a big deal. But then if you're a big deal when you're in a commercial, you could be accused of selling out. I still to this day never could understand why Jerry Seinfeld was selling American Express when he didn't have to, right? He was richer than God, but he's still doing it. But in the absence of this wide-scale commercial context, I can only assume that one, they were compensated well, and two, that this wasn't slumming in the way that it could be for a good, well-known actor in the West. It wasn't necessarily beneath them. In a way, it might have even been kind of cool, right? Because it's so unusual, and it even has a little hint of sort of Western Western consumer culture, so that I think a lot of the disincentives that people like them in the West might have had, along with a lot of the financial incentives, were not there. But again, that's pure speculation.
And we have a question from Dominic Lawton. Dominic, I'll ask you to unmute.
Yes, thanks so much for the talk. This was really fascinating. I wanted to ask, since we began with Resina Trieste and Mayakovsky and and all of this, and you have Lily Brick right there behind you. I was really struck by what felt like a very lingering sort of Mayakovskian presence in the first TV commercial, the Payusha Kuruza. I mean, the corn and all of these, kitchen implements kind of moving along and then proclaiming that they're there to be eaten. Seems extremely Mayakovsky, right? Like it comes right out of the end of Mysteria Bouffe, when all of the tools and the foodstuffs are doing exactly that, at the kind of proletarian promised land. And then even before the revolution, in the Mayakovsky Tragedia, there's this Восстание вещей, which is also sort of similar. And of course, like Mayakovsky is well known and decently studied as a kind of Soviet advertising pioneer in the 20s, right? But not normally this particular trope of these things moving around and speaking, which is associated more with his poetry and to some extent with his kind of experimental stage work. And so then to see something that feels so in tune with that in the first example of Soviet TV advertising you present just feels really suggestive. So I'm curious to know if there was any kind of conscious reception of Mayakovsky by these early advertisers.
That's interesting. I don't know, but what I would say is that when you say it, I totally see the Mayakovsky resemblance in that commercial. When I was watching it, I was thinking, this is like some of the cooler kids animation that you could have, but that doesn't mean it can't be both. But Mayakovsky's influence, I don't think you see much Mayakovsky influence if it's there. After that in the commercials, You see it still in print and in posters, right? I mean, one of the things that always struck me about late Soviet propaganda posters, for the most part, I mean, it starts to change a bit in Perestroika, is how aesthetically beholden they were to the 1920s and 1930s. That is, they were still using the same, to some extent, the same color palette, and largely the same sense of design as from decades ago, which on the one hand, you could say, well, it was really good decades ago. On the other hand, you could say, isn't it time to do something different? And then on the third hand, you could say, this is why it's easy to ignore it, because it looks like everything else. What I see in the commercials that I saw today is, and this fits in with the idea that the people who are making these commercials are also people who are making film, how much, with the exception of the weird jump cuts and all that, how much this looks sort of like, post-thaw cinema, right? And that's where, there was the question of Ironia Suzbli. I think that's where a lot of the aesthetic comes from. At times, it's not just the actors. It feels like we're watching like a tiny clip of a not bad Soviet movie.
And we have a question from Jared Bateman. Thank you for an excellent informative talk. I didn't make it back in time and had to stop at a coffee shop, so could this question be read for me? Yes. Would cinema directors ever direct commercials, or were they all done by TV specialists?
So cinema directors, as I understand it, did direct commercials. And then also, and I could be mistaken about this, and Marina Vinogradova might be able to correct me on this. My sense has always been that the boundaries between television and film were a little more porous in Soviet times than they were, say, in Hollywood. So that this would be a bit less of an issue, but I have seen that there are definitely some filmmakers, as opposed to only television makers, making some of these commercials. Yeah, Maria.
And here I can unmute you, Maria.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just about to ask a question, and also following up on what you just said, Eliot, about cinema directors directing those films. That indeed happened, and also what I became aware of very recently is that sometimes they could take some very popular series like Nu Pogodi, about the hare and the wolf, and create an episode advertising a product that happened to advertise an amateur film camera called Quartz One. So that was, and that didn't air on television with the regular series. So it's like hiring the film stars to play in advertising. But the reason I raised my hand is actually I have a question, comment, and I just wonder, what you think about this. So you've raised the issue of the Soviet advertising being about scarce goods rather than scarce consumers, that there was really not much of an economic reason to advertise goods. But I wonder if by the 70s, actually, the situation was a little bit different, and if the economic component was a part of that as well, because economic historians describe the planned economy as being characterized by gluts and deficits of goods. So something is missing, and then all of a sudden a certain area of the country gets, I don't know, 500 million pairs of socks of the same kind. So I wonder if one reason to inform people about the goods that were available is actually precisely to be prepared for the situation when suddenly they appear at a certain Jupiter or Unona store somewhere, so that they know that this is actually what they want. I mean, for me, it's purely speculative, but I wonder if you've come across evidence, or perhaps some other way of, understanding what the situation was was here. Thank you.
Well, thanks. That's very useful. A very useful thing to bring up. I like the idea of a billion socks somewhere. I imagine, like, or a billion left shoes somewhere in Samara, and then a billion right shoes somewhere in Turkmenia. But that would make sense. That would make sense, and I would be able to answer that if I had a sense that the scope that I'm seeing like a representative scope of commercials, but what I'm largely seeing are the things people put up on YouTube, because I'm not doing the real research, because this isn't a real research project. So based on that small, non-representative, unscientific sample, I would say that what we're seeing, certainly the things I showed you today, would be unlikely to be the subject of a glut, right? Like a glut of trailers, for instance. I think you very well may be right. But I don't think the commercials that I've selected for today would show that you are. And I don't know how to, and I don't have access to the right sort of information to test the hypothesis.
And a question from Shujat Mirza. Any idea what went behind before the commercials got released? Who decided which ones went on air, etc.?
No. All the things that a real researcher should know. I have no idea.
And we have a question from Matisse Steinertz. Hello, did you pay attention to ads that were read out by TV hosts and not necessarily in the form of a commercial? They were a series of informative announcements.
Yeah, and in fact, that's something that that we had in the West too, particularly on radio, right? Radio hosts would read these announcements. No, I did not look at that. That would be interesting to look at. And again, I'm not sure where I would find it because I haven't done that sort of work. And then that would be an interesting point of comparison, right? Because there's a significant qualitative difference between an announcer reading that stuff off and having this little mini story, audiovisual fairy tale for you to watch. That the latter is obviously much more interesting and entertaining and can be about more than just the thing. Whereas if I'm imagining correctly how these things were read out, they would really be about the thing that they're reading out, right? Because there'd be nothing else, there'd be not much of a larger context of bells and whistles to make the thing attractive. But that would be a really good thing to look at.
And I think that is all of our questions, unless anybody has something else to add.
Okay. Well, next week you can watch as a chicken is being ground up into horrifying food on Estonian television, on Soviet television. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see some of you back for some of the later lectures. The great thing is you don't have to watch these in any order. You can come and go as you please, and it's always nice to see people's faces. So thank you all.